The air in the antechamber was a testament to manufactured perfection, a sterile, silent medium, scrubbed of dust and pollen and the stray, rebellious scent of living things, leaving only the faint metallic tang of recycled oxygen and the cloying sweetness of the lilies that lined the hall in funereal procession. Elian stood before the full-length chromic mirror, his reflection a stranger, rendered in shades of cream and pearl. The unification robes, woven from synth silk that whispered against his skin with the sound of falling ash, were heavy. Each pearl studding the high collar felt like a vertebra in a cage being constructed around his throat. He was an asset. The thought was not his own. It was a whisper of his father's voice, a lesson etched into his bones since birth. An Omega of his lineage was not a person, but a political instrument, a vessel for alliances, a guarantee of stability. Today, he would be unified with Reese, a beta, a sensible choice, a safe choice. Reese was the director of resource allocation, a man whose heart beat in steady, predictable rhythms, whose scent was a mild, unobtrusive blend of paper and clean linen. There would be no violent passions, no tempestuous claiming fevers, no primal chaos. There would be order, concordance. That was the promise of their world, the creed of the citadel that floated above the smog-choked ruins of the old world. He lifted a hand, the sleeve falling back to reveal the pale, unblemished skin of his wrist. No mark. Not yet. After the ceremony, after the vows of fidelity and social contract, Reese would be permitted to place a bonding mark, a gentle, symbolic bite, more pressure than puncture. It would not be a true alpha's claim, the kind spoken of in hushed, fearful tones, a maelstrom of possession that overwrote will and fused two souls into one. It would be a beta bond, respectful, consensual, and utterly devoid of the fire that Elian secretly, shamefully read about in censored histories. He traced the spot with a fingertip, a faint tremor running through him. Was this all there was? This quiet, beautiful, suffocating room? This life of serene emptiness? His gaze drifted past his own reflection to the window beyond. The armored glass looked out over the expanse of the citadel, a city of white spires and clean lines, all of it suspended in the clear, filtered air. Below, veiled by a perpetual shroud of grey-brown haze, was the Undercity, the forgotten world, the place where alphas and omegas who refused the Concordance's pacifying protocols were rumored to live in squalor and savagery. A shudder, potent and unwelcome, traced its way down his spine. He was grateful for the Concordance. He was. It had saved them from the feral instincts that had torn their ancestors apart. It had created peace, a perfect, silent peace. The door chimed, a soft, three-note melody that signaled the arrival of his father. The mirror shimmered, turning opaque at a silent, mental command. He did not want to see the mask of placid obedience he wore when his father was near. The door slid open with a sigh of pneumatics. Prefect Valerius entered, his presence sucking the last vestiges of warmth from the room. He was a man carved from ice, his features sharp and patrician, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He wore the severe, dark uniform of the High Council, adorned only with the silver sigil of his office. His scent was non-existent, scrubbed away by daily neutralizers, a testament to his supreme control. "You are ready," he stated. It was not a question. His eyes performed a clinical assessment of Elian, cataloguing the perfect fall of the silk, the serene expression, the compliant posture. Elian was his greatest achievement, a perfectly conditioned Omega, a masterpiece of nurture over nature. Reese is waiting. The council is assembled. Do not forget your purpose, Elian. His father's voice was low, each word a carefully polished stone dropped into the silence. This unification solidifies the trade accords with the southern sector. It ensures the flow of resources for the next decade. Your contentment is secondary to your function. Elian inclined his head, the pearls at his neck cold against his skin. I understand, father. I will not falter. The lie was so practiced, it felt like truth. He would not falter because he was incapable of it. He was a beautifully crafted doll, and his strings were held in his father's unyielding hands. Valerius gave a curt nod, a gesture that passed for approval. The procession will begin in 5 minutes. He turned, his boots making no sound on the polished floor, and was gone. The door slid shut, and the silence it left behind was heavier than before. Elian allowed himself one single, shuddering breath. 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, his life would be set in its placid, unchangeable course. He would be Mrs. Director Reese, a quiet partner to a quiet man. His days filled with meaningless charity work and sterile social gatherings. The potential for anything more, for the wild, terrifying spark he sometimes dreamed of, would be extinguished forever. The scent of the lilies seemed to grow stronger, sweeter, like the perfume of decay. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to shatter the window, to breathe the toxic, unfiltered air of the world below, to feel something, anything, other than this pristine numbness. The urge was so violent it made him dizzy. He pressed a hand to his chest, his heart, a frantic bird beating against the cage of his ribs. But he did not move. He did not scream. He smoothed down the front of his robes, the synth silk cool and unforgiving beneath his palm. He was a Valerius. He was an asset. And assets did not have urges. They had functions. The chimes sounded again, this time the longer, more resonant sequence that signaled the start of the ceremony. It was time. He walked towards the door, his steps measured and even, a perfect porcelain figure moving towards its designated place on the shelf. The grand chamber was a cavern of white marble and cold light. Sunlight, filtered through a vast, polarizing ceiling dome, fell in sterile columns upon the assembled guests. They were a sea of muted greys and blues, the elite of the citadel, their expressions uniformly placid, their sense all neutralized into a collective, scentless void. The only spots of color were the floral arrangements, more lilies, their white petals like frozen screams, and Elian himself, a solitary pearl navigating a sea of stone. He walked the long aisle alone, as was tradition. This was not a union of families, but a contract between an individual and the state, personified by his intended. At the end of the aisle, on a raised dais, stood Reese. He looked exactly as Elian had expected, calm, composed, his pale hair perfectly coiffed, his light grey suit immaculate. He offered a small, reassuring smile as Elian approached, his eyes kind. It was the kindness of a zookeeper for a rare, beautiful animal, a gentle, appreciative, and fundamentally distant affection. Elian took his place beside him, his hands clasped demurely in front of him. Below them, his father watched from the front row, his face an unreadable mask of authority. The officiant, a woman with a voice as colorless as the light, began the recitation of the concordance mandate. The words washed over Elian, a familiar litany of social responsibility, emotional regulation, and the virtues of stability. He tuned them out, focusing on the slight pressure of Reese's hand as it tentatively found his. The touch was dry and cool, safe, so terribly, terribly safe. He felt a wave of nausea, swift and disorienting. He was going to be sick. Here, in front of the entire governing body of the Citadel, he was going to disgrace himself. He squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second, forcing the feeling down, locking it away in the deepest part of himself. The officiant's drone continued. And in the spirit of this concordance, do you, Reese of Sector Gamma, accept the responsibilities of this unification to provide stability, support, and societal partnership to Elian of House Valerius? I do, Reese said, his voice clear and steady. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs. It was his turn. The next words would seal his fate. And do you, Elian of House Valerius, accept the responsibilities of this unification to offer fealty, harmony, and societal grace to Reese of Sector Gamma? The silence stretched. It was only a second, but it felt like an eternity. He could feel his father's gaze boring into him. He could feel the weight of 1,000 expectant eyes. He opened his mouth. The words were there, on the tip of his tongue. And then it happened. The scent. It was not a scent. It was a cataclysm. It tore through the sterile, neutralized air of the chamber like a lightning strike, a physical force that hit Elian in the chest and stole the breath from his lungs. Ozone and petrichor, the smell of a storm breaking over a parched earth. Pine needles crushed underfoot in a wild, ancient forest. A raw, elemental power that was utterly alien to this world of manufactured tranquility. It was alpha. Not the pacified, dulled alphas of the Citadel, but something primal, untamed, and overwhelming. Every instinct in Elian's body, every cell he had been taught to suppress and ignore, screamed to life. His head snapped up, his eyes scanning the chamber in a blind panic. The guests were stirring, murmuring in confusion, their placid masks cracking. And then he saw him. Standing in the grand archway at the back of the chamber, framed against the light, was a silhouette. The man was tall and broad, a stark, dark shape against the sterile white. As he moved forward, the silence of the room broke, shattered by his footsteps. They were not the silent, gliding steps of the Citadel's elite. They were heavy, deliberate, the sound of a predator entering a neatly ordered cage. He wore no formal attire, only the dark, utilitarian fatigues of the undercity, his boots caked with the grime of the world below. His hair was black and unruly, and his face was all harsh angles and shadow, dominated by eyes that burned with a cold, silver fire. Scars marked his face, faint white lines that spoke of a life lived outside the Citadel's protective embrace. The prefectural guard, the Concordance's enforcers, moved to intercept him, their stun batons humming to life. They were 2, then 4, sleek and disciplined in their grey uniforms. The man did not slow his pace. The first guard lunged. The man moved with a blur of speed that was shockingly efficient. A hand shot out, grabbing the guard's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the guard crumpled to the floor, screaming. The second guard swung his baton. The man ducked under the blow, his body coiling and unspringing like a powerful animal. His fist connected with the guard's helmet with a dull, concussive thud. The guard dropped like a stone. The remaining 2 hesitated, their training warring with the primal fear this man projected. He ignored them, his silver eyes fixed on one person and one person only. On Elian. Elian could not move. He was paralyzed, pinned by that incandescent gaze. The world had narrowed to the space between them. The scent was a physical presence now, wrapping around him, sinking into his skin, into his lungs. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. It felt like coming home. Rhys had stepped in front of him, a protective, if futile, gesture. "This is a restricted ceremony," Rhys said, his voice tight with alarm, but remarkably steady. "You are not welcome here. Identify yourself." The man stopped at the foot of the dais. He looked up, his gaze flicking from Rhys to Elian with an unnerving intensity. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips, a feral slash of white in his grim face. He did not speak to Rhys. He did not even seem to register him as a significant obstacle. His voice, when it came, was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the marble floor, through the soles of Elian's shoes, and into his very bones. It was directed solely at Elian. "You are not his," the man said, the words a simple, absolute statement of fact. Then he raised his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the horrified assembly, his voice rising to fill the vast chamber, laced with an authority that dwarfed everyone present, even Prefect Valerius. "This Omega is mine," chaos erupted, but Elian heard nothing. He saw only the man's eyes, silver and endless as a winter storm, and he smelled the rain, the earth, the wild, and the free. His carefully constructed world had not just cracked, it had been utterly and irrevocably annihilated. The man, the Alpha, vaulted onto the dais in a single, fluid motion that was all coiled muscle and predatory grace. Rhys stood his ground, his face pale but determined. "You will not touch him," he said, his voice trembling but firm. It was brave. It was foolish. The Alpha didn't even look at him. He simply extended an arm and shoved Rhys aside. It wasn't a violent blow, but it was dismissive, contemptuous, like brushing away a fly. Rhys stumbled backward, tripping over the floral arrangements and landing in an undignified heap of crushed lilies and bruised pride. The Alpha's attention was a physical force, a focused beam of heat that fell entirely on Elian. He took a step closer, and Elian flinched back, his suppressed Omega instincts screaming in a terrifying chorus of fear and something else, something that felt dangerously like recognition. "Stay away from me," Elian whispered, the words barely audible. His voice was a thin, reedy thing, stripped of all its practiced composure. The Alpha's expression softened almost imperceptibly. The raw power in his gaze gentled, replaced by something ancient and possessive and achingly familiar. He reached out a hand, not to grab, but with his palm open, an invitation. His fingers were long and calloused, his knuckles scarred. This was a hand that had known work and struggle and violence. It was the antithesis of the soft, manicured hands of the Citadel. "I am not here to harm you," he said, his voice a low rumble meant only for Elian. "I am here to take you home." Home? This madman spoke of home. Elian's home was here, in this sterile, predictable world. This was his cage, but it was the only one he had ever known. Below, from the front row, Prefect Valerius was on his feet. His face, for the first time in Elian's memory, was not a mask of cold control. It was a canvas of pure, undiluted fury. "Enforcers, subdue him. Use lethal force if necessary." The remaining guards, bolstered by their prefect's command and the arrival of reinforcements, surged forward. The Alpha's head snapped around, a low growl tearing from his throat. It was not a human sound. It was the sound of a wolf cornered, a deep, guttural threat that promised death. It resonated in Elian's bones, and a part of him, a wild and feral part he never knew existed, wanted to answer it with a cry of his own. He watched, frozen, as the alpha became a whirlwind of brutal efficiency. He moved through the grey uniformed enforcers not like a man fighting, but like a force of nature. There was no wasted motion, no flourish, just a devastating economy of violence. A block, a strike, a disarm. He broke limbs with a cold, detached precision, his silver eyes never losing their focus. He was not fighting with rage. He was clearing a path to Elian. One of the enforcers managed to get behind him, raising a stun baton to strike at the base of his skull. "Look out!" The cry was ripped from Elian's throat before he could stop it. It was involuntary, a desperate, instinctual sound. The alpha reacted instantly, spinning around and catching the enforcer's arm, twisting it until the man shrieked and dropped the weapon. He kicked the baton away and incapacitated the man with a single, precise blow to the temple. Then he turned back to Elian, and in his eyes there was a flicker of something that looked like triumph. He had heard. He had listened. The realization horrified Elian. He had helped him. He had warned his own captor. "Come," the alpha said, his voice now urgent. He reached forward again, and this time his fingers brushed against Elian's. The contact was an electric shock. A jolt of pure energy arced between them, and for a dizzying second, Elian's world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of sensory information that was not his own. He felt the grit of the undercity floor beneath worn boot soles, tasted the metallic tang of blood on his tongue, saw the faces of the enforcers through a haze of silver-eyed fury, and smelled. He smelled his own scent, the scent of fear-laced jasmine and rain-soaked stone from the outside, a scent of longing. It was the alpha's senses, his emotions, crashing into Elian's mind. A bond. It was the beginning of a bond. He snatched his hand back as if burned, stumbling away, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. "No," he gasped, shaking his head. "No, this is wrong." The alpha's face hardened with impatience. The chamber was filling with more enforcers, their formations more disciplined now, their weapons raised. They were creating a perimeter. "We are out of time," he growled. He lunged forward, and this time there was no gentleness. He scooped Elian into his arms as if he weighed nothing. One arm clamped around his back, the other under his knees. Elian let out a choked cry of protest, his hands flying up to push against the solid wall of the alpha's chest. It was like pushing against granite. "Let me go. Put me down." The alpha ignored him, holding him tight against his body. The proximity was overwhelming. The scent of storm and pine was everywhere, a thick, intoxicating cloud that scrambled his thoughts. His body, the traitorous Omega body he had been taught to despise, instinctively tried to curl closer, seeking the heat and strength of the alpha's frame. He was property being stolen, and yet he felt a terrifying sense of security. The alpha turned. Elian held securely in his arms and surveyed the closing net of enforcers. He was trapped. There was no way out. The grand entrance was blocked. "Surrender, vagrant," a commander shouted through a voice amplifier. "You are in violation of Concordance Mandate 7. Release the Omega. Your compliance will be noted." The alpha let out a short, harsh laugh. "I do not comply." He took a step back, moving towards the edge of the dais, towards the great armored window that overlooked the chasm between the citadel and the world below. Elian's eyes widened in horror. He knew what the alpha was going to do. "No," he breathed, his struggles becoming frantic. "No, you can't." The Alpha looked down at him, his silver eyes locking with Elian's terrified blue ones. For a fleeting moment, the feral intensity was gone, replaced by a look of profound, almost sorrowful resolve. "Hold on," he murmured. And then he ran. He ran directly at the window. The enforcers surged forward, but they were too slow. With a final, powerful stride, the Alpha leaped. For a heart-stopping second, they were suspended in the air, framed against the cold, sterile light of the chamber. Then came the deafening crash of reinforced glass shattering. The sound was the death knell of Elian's old life. The world exploded into a vortex of wind and noise and falling glass. The sterile, recycled air of the citadel was ripped away, replaced by the raw, chemical-laced wind that howled up from the depths. Elian screamed, burying his face against the Alpha's chest, his arms wrapping around the man's neck in a desperate, instinctual grip. He felt the sickening sensation of falling, the ground rushing up to meet them. This was it. This was death. A far better fate, perhaps, than the life he was leaving behind. But he was still terrified. He clung to the solid warmth of the Alpha, the only anchor in a world that had dissolved into chaos. He felt the Alpha shift his weight in mid-air, twisting his body to shield Elian's with his own. Then there was a sharp, metallic zip and a sudden, violent jerk that snapped Elian's teeth together. Their descent slowed abruptly, arrested not by the ground, but by a high-tensile wire the Alpha had fired from a device on his wrist, anchoring them to the understructure of the citadel. They swung in a wide, terrifying arc, the wind tearing at them, the undercity a dizzying tapestry of rust and ruin far below. Elian risked a glance upward. He saw the shattered window of the grand chamber, a jagged black mouth in the pristine white face of the spire. He saw tiny figures, his father, Reese, the enforcers, watching them disappear into the smog. They looked like insects, insignificant. Then the Alpha was moving again, rappelling down the side of the citadel with a speed and confidence that was inhuman. Elian squeezed his eyes shut again, his senses overwhelmed. The wind roared in his ears, carrying with it the smells of the world below, damp earth, industrial waste, cooking fires, and the unneutralized, chaotic blend of 1,000 living beings. It was foul. It was terrifying. It was the most alive he had ever felt. He didn't know how long they descended. Time had lost all meaning. There was only the wind, the dizzying height, and the solid, unyielding presence of the Alpha holding him. Finally, with a jolt, their feet touched solid ground, or what passed for it. It was a metal rooftop, slick with some kind of grime. The Alpha gently set Elian down, though he kept a steadying hand on his arm, as if he knew Elian's legs would not hold him. Elian swayed, his knees weak, his entire body trembling with adrenaline and shock. He was still clad in his magnificent, ridiculous unification robes, now streaked with filth and torn from the descent. The pearls on his collar felt heavier than ever. He looked around. They were in a different world. The sky above was not the clear, empty blue of the citadel, but a permanent, bruised twilight filtered through the thick layer of smog and the citadel's massive undercarriage. The architecture was a chaotic jumble of rusted metal, repurposed shipping containers, and crumbling concrete, all stacked precariously on top of each other. Wires and pipes snaked everywhere like metallic vines. The air was thick and wet, and it smelled of decay and life, 1,000 scents mingling into a complex, overwhelming whole. This was the Undercity. He had been stolen from his pristine tower and dragged into the gutter. He turned to the Alpha, his fear finally coalescing into a sharp, cold rage. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking, but laced with the imperious tone he had been taught to use. "What gives you the right?" The Alpha watched him, his expression unreadable. He reached up and pulled a grimy hood over his dark hair, his face falling into shadow. "Rights are not given," he said, his voice flat. "They are taken." He gestured to Elian's robes. "You need to get out of those. They make you a target." Before Elian could protest, the Alpha was moving again, grabbing his hand and pulling him along. His grip was firm, inescapable. "Where are you taking me?" Elian cried, stumbling to keep up. "To somewhere safe," the Alpha said, his voice a low growl. "Now be quiet. Your scent is like a beacon down here. We need to disappear." And with that, he pulled Elian into the labyrinthine darkness of the Undercity, leaving the sterile white light of the citadel and the life Elian had known far, far behind. The labyrinth of the Undercity swallowed them whole. It was a world of perpetual twilight, illuminated by the haphazard glow of bare bulbs, flickering neon signs, and the occasional open fire crackling in a rusted drum. The clean, geometric lines of the citadel were replaced by a chaotic organicism, a tangle of narrow alleyways, precarious catwalks, and crowded plazas. The silence Elian was accustomed to was gone, replaced by a constant, low thrum of life, the distant clang of metal on metal, the murmur of 100 different conversations in a dozen dialects, the cry of a child, the sizzle of food cooking on a makeshift grill, and the smells, oh, the smells. They were a constant assault on his senses, which had been sheltered from anything but sterile perfection. He smelled damp concrete, rust, spicy food, unwashed bodies, fragrant smoke, and something that was simply the scent of thousands of people living in close proximity, their unneutralized pheromones creating a thick, heady soup in the air. It was nauseating and yet strangely, viscerally alive. The Alpha, he still didn't have a name for his captor, pulled him through the throng with a relentless, urgent purpose. People melted out of their path. They saw the Alpha's size, the grim set of his jaw, the feral intensity in his silver eyes, and they gave him a wide berth. Elian, in his torn, cream-colored silk robes, was a spectacle. He drew stares of shock, curiosity, and in some eyes, a predatory avarice. He felt naked, exposed, a rare pale fish dropped into a tank of piranhas. He clutched at the Alpha's arm, the only solid thing in this swirling chaos, his earlier anger momentarily eclipsed by a primal fear. They finally stopped in a dark, narrow alley that smelled of stagnant water and ozone. The Alpha pressed him back against a cold, damp wall, his body shielding Elian from the main thoroughfare. He was so close, Elian could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the faint silver light of his eyes in the gloom. "The robes," the Alpha said, his voice low and rough. "They have to go. Now." Elian recoiled. "I'm not taking my clothes off in an alley." A flicker of something, annoyance, amusement, crossed the Alpha's face. "I have something for you to wear." He shrugged off a heavy pack he'd been carrying, one Elian hadn't even noticed in the chaos of their escape. He pulled out a bundle of dark, rough-spun fabric. It was a simple tunic and trousers, the kind of utilitarian clothing everyone here seemed to wear. He tossed them at Elian. "Change." Elian hesitated, clutching the bundle. The synth silk of his robes was a familiar weight, a last tattered remnant of his old life. To take them off felt like a final surrender. The alpha seemed to read his thoughts. His voice softened, losing some of its harsh edge. I know this is a shock, but up there, he gestured vaguely towards the unseen citadel. You were a symbol. Down here, that symbol makes you a target. For them, another gesture upward. And for others who would see you as valuable property. He was not an asset. The thought, his father's voice, echoed in his mind, now twisted into a new, more sinister meaning. Here his value was not political. It was crudely physical. He was a prize to be captured, sold, or broken. The realization sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the damp air. He turned his back to the alpha, his fingers fumbling with the intricate pearl clasps at his throat. They were designed to be undone by a servant, and his trembling hands could barely manage the task. A low growl of impatience rumbled from the alpha's chest. Here, before Elian could protest, strong, calloused fingers were at his neck, brushing his own aside. The alpha's touch was surprisingly deft. He worked the clasps with an economy of motion, his knuckles grazing the sensitive skin of Elian's nape. The touch sent a shiver through Elian, a confusing mixture of fear and something warm that pooled low in his belly. In moments, the heavy collar was undone, and the robes loosened. The alpha stepped back, giving him space. Humiliation warred with a desperate need for survival. Elian quickly shed the ruined silk, the cool air raising goosebumps on his skin. The fabric pooled at his feet, a pale, ghostly puddle in the darkness. For a moment, he stood in just his thin undergarments, feeling utterly vulnerable. He scrambled to pull on the rough tunic and trousers. The fabric was coarse against his skin, a stark contrast to the frictionless silk he was used to. It smelled of the alpha, of pine and storm, and something uniquely, personally him. Wearing it felt like being wrapped in the man's scent, a second skin that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. When he was done, the alpha took the discarded robes and shoved them deep into a waste reclamation chute. They'll be incinerated within the hour, he said, his tone final. He looked Elian over, his silver eyes lingering for a moment. The simple, dark clothes were a strange camouflage. They didn't fit his slender frame or his pale, aristocratic features, but they made him anonymous, another shadow in a city of shadows. Better, the alpha grunted. He pulled the hood of his own cloak lower, then tugged the smaller hood of Elian's new tunic up, hiding his bright, conspicuous hair. Stay close. Don't speak to anyone. He started moving again, and Elian followed without a word, the coarse fabric of his new clothes scratching at his skin, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. They navigated a maze of rusted gantries and dripping tunnels, moving deeper and deeper into the bowels of the Undercity. The sounds and smells grew denser, more intense. Elian felt his carefully regulated senses begin to overload. The lights were too bright, the shadows too dark, the noises too loud. He felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, his vision blurring at the edges. He stumbled, his legs giving out. The alpha caught him before he hit the ground, his arm a woj steel band around Elian's waist. "What's wrong?" he demanded, his voice sharp with concern. "It's too much," Elian gasped, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. "The light, the noise." The alpha swore under his breath. "Of course. Sensory overload. Your entire life has been lived in a sensory deprivation tank." He guided Elian into a darker, quieter alcove, shielding him once more with his body. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice low and steady. "Just breathe. Focus on one thing. Focus on my voice." Elian tried, but his heart was still pounding, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Panic was a cold tide rising in his chest. "I can't." "Yes, you can." The Alpha's hand moved from his waist to the back of his neck, his thumb pressing firmly into the spot just below his skull. The pressure was grounding, a single, solid point of contact in the overwhelming chaos. "Focus on my scent," the Alpha murmured, his voice close to Elian's ear. It was an insane command. The Alpha's scent was the source of the initial cataclysm, the thing that had shattered his world, but now, in the midst of this sensory assault, it was the only constant, the only scent not warring for his attention. He tentatively inhaled, forcing himself to push past the chaotic miasma of the city and find that one specific fragrance: storm and earth and pine. He focused on it, breaking it down, the sharp tang of ozone like the air after a lightning strike, the clean, damp smell of a forest floor, the wild, untamed scent that was purely Alpha. Slowly, miraculously, the world began to recede. The flashing lights dimmed, the cacophony of sounds faded to a dull roar, his breathing evened out, his heartbeat slowed from a frantic panic to a steady, heavy thrum. The Alpha's scent was an anchor, a focal point that allowed his overwhelmed mind to filter out the rest. He didn't know how long they stood there, Elian leaning against the solid wall of the Alpha's chest, the Alpha's hand, a warm, heavy weight on his neck. It could have been minutes, or an hour. When Elian finally felt steady enough to stand on his own, he pushed himself away slightly, embarrassed by his weakness and his reliance on this stranger. "Thank you," he mumbled, not meeting the Alpha's eyes. The Alpha just grunted in response, his hand dropping from Elian's neck, leaving a phantom warmth behind. "We're almost there." They walked for another 10 minutes, the path growing quieter and darker. They were moving away from the crowded central sectors and into what seemed to be a more residential area, if one could call the stacked, precarious dwellings that. Finally, the Alpha stopped before a heavy, rusted metal door, unmarked and indistinguishable from a dozen others they had passed. He produced a key, an old-fashioned, physical piece of metal, and unlocked it. The door swung inward with a groan of protest, revealing a pitch-black interior. The Alpha gestured for Elian to enter. Elian hesitated on the threshold. This was it, the point of no return. Once he stepped through that door, he was truly in his captor's power, in his territory. Every instinct screamed at him to run. But where would he go? Back into the overwhelming chaos of the Undercity, where he would be hunted and captured within the hour. He looked at the Alpha, a dark, imposing silhouette against the dim light of the corridor. He had saved Elian from the enforcers, shielded him from the fall, clothed him, and calmed him from a panic attack. He was a kidnapper, a brute, a savage, but he had not harmed him. Not yet. With a deep, shuddering breath, Elian stepped over the threshold into the darkness, into the Alpha's den. The door clanged shut behind him, the sound of a tomb sealing. He was plunged into absolute blackness, the only sound the soft click of the lock and the Alpha's steady breathing somewhere behind him. A moment later, a light flickered on. It was a single bare bulb hanging from a wire, casting a weak yellow glow over a small Spartan room. The walls were unadorned sheet metal, the floor bare concrete. There was a narrow cot against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs, and a tiny alcove that presumably served as a kitchenette, containing a hot plate and a small, humming cooler unit. A single, grimy porthole, sealed with thick glass, was the only window. It was a cell, a stark, functional, miserable cell. The Alpha moved past him, shrugging off his pack and dropping it onto the floor with a heavy thud. He ran a hand through his dark, damp hair, his shoulders slumping slightly. For the first time, Elian saw a hint of exhaustion in his powerful frame. Now that they were alone, in the quiet, the questions came rushing back, sharp and insistent. "Why?" Elian asked, his voice echoing slightly in the small space. "Why did you do this? Who are you?" The Alpha turned to face him. In the dim light, the angles of his face were stark, the shadows deep. The silver of his eyes seemed to glow. He held Elian's gaze for a long moment, a silent, intense scrutiny that felt like it was peeling back layers of Elian's soul. "My name is Kale," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "And I did it because your unification was a lie. Your life was a lie." Elian stiffened. "You know nothing about my life." "I know you were suffocating," Kale said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming almost a whisper. "I know you stood on that dais and looked out at your perfect, sterile world and felt like you were dying. I know because I felt it with you." Elian's breath hitched. How could he know that? The sensory link during their escape. Had it been more than just a fleeting connection? Had this Alpha been watching him, feeling him? "That's impossible," Elian said, shaking his head, the denial a flimsy shield against a terrifying truth. Kyle took a step closer. He was so tall, he seemed to fill the entire room. "Is it? Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you wanted to bond with that beta. Tell me you were happy." Elian couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come. Because it would be a lie. And he was so tired of lying. He looked away, his gaze falling on the single, narrow cot. There was only one bed. The reality of their situation crashed down on him with renewed force. He was trapped here, in this tiny room, with a primal Alpha who claimed to feel his emotions, an Alpha whose scent alone could unravel him, his captor, his savior, his... what? Kale followed his gaze. He seemed to understand the direction of Elian's thoughts. A wry, humorless smile touched his lips. "You can have the bed," he said, his voice devoid of any predatory inflection. It was a simple statement of fact. "I'll take the floor. You are not my prisoner, Elian. You are under my protection." "Protection?" Elian's voice was sharp with bitter irony. "You call this protection? You shattered my life. I was about to be unified. I had a future, a place." "You had a cage," Kyle countered, his voice hardening again, the silver in his eyes flaring. "A gilded one, but a cage nonetheless. They were dulling your senses, suppressing your nature. They were turning you into a ghost. I took you so you could be real." He took another step, closing the space between them until he was only an arm's length away. He reached out, not to touch, but to hover his hand just over Elian's chest, over his heart. "I felt it," he said, his voice a low, intense rumble. "The moment I entered that chamber. Your heart. It was beating like a trapped bird. And when you saw me, it didn't beat with fear. Not at first. It beat with recognition." Elian stood frozen, mesmerized by the intensity in Kyle's gaze. He could feel the heat from Kyle's hand, even without the touch. He could feel his own heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, wild thing that was no longer silent, no longer obedient. It was beating in time with the storm in Kyle's eyes, in time with the scent of pine and rain that now filled the small metal room, a scent that was no longer just a scent, but a promise of a world Elian had never dared to imagine, a world that was real. The first few days were a war of silence. Elian claimed the cot, wrapping himself in the thin, coarse blanket as if it were armor. He spent hours staring at the grimy porthole, which offered only a sliver of a view of a rust-colored wall and a perpetually dripping pipe. The rhythmic drip became the clock of his new life. Kale was a ghost in the small space. He moved with a quiet efficiency that belied his size, his presence a constant, low hum of energy at the edge of Elian's awareness. He slept on a thin bedroll on the floor, a dark shape in the corner of the room, and was always awake before Elian, gone for long stretches of time, returning with meager rations, dense protein bars that tasted of nothing, pouches of purified water, and occasionally a piece of strange, misshapen fruit that was shockingly sweet. They did not speak. The silence was a battlefield, and Elian wielded it as his only weapon. He refused to give Kyle the satisfaction of engagement, of complaint, of fear. He would be a statue, a ghost, a thing that Kyle had stolen but could not possess. He would show him that he had made a mistake, that the vibrant, real person Kyle claimed to have seen did not exist. There was only this empty shell. But Kyle did not seem to require a response. He seemed content to exist in the same space, his silver eyes occasionally flicking towards Elian with a watchful, unreadable intensity. He would sit at the small table cleaning a weapon or repairing a piece of complex-looking tech, his large, scarred hands moving with a surgeon's precision. In these moments, Elian would watch him from under his lashes, a strange fascination warring with his resentment. Kale was a creature of contradictions, a brutal warrior who moved with a dancer's grace, a kidnapper who offered Elian his only bed and the first choice of their limited food, a primal alpha whose scent should have driven Elian into a state of frantic submission, but who instead treated him with a strange, almost clinical distance. On the third day, the silence finally broke. Elian was tracing the condensation on the inside of the porthole when Kale spoke from behind him. "Your father has declared you dead." Elian froze, his finger hovering over the cold glass. He did not turn. "A tragic casualty of the terrorist attack on the Grand Chamber," Kale continued, his voice flat, emotionless, as if reading a news report. "Abducted and presumed killed by the Undercity savage who perpetrated the assault. There will be a state funeral. Your body, of course, will not be recovered. Prefect Valerius gave a moving eulogy on the public comms. He spoke of your grace, your gentle spirit, your unwavering dedication to the Concordance." The words were like stones, each one hitting Elian with a dull, heavy impact. Dead. To his world, to his father, he was dead. He had not been stolen. He had been erased. He should have felt something, grief, anger, loss, but all he felt was a vast, hollow emptiness. His father had not lost a son. He had lost an asset. And rather than admit the asset was compromised, he had written it off, cut his losses, and constructed a politically convenient narrative. Of course he had. "He mourns the disruption to his trade accords, I imagine," Elian said, his own voice sounding distant and strange. It was the first thing he had said to Kale in 2 days. Kale was silent for a moment. "Yes," he finally said. "That too." Elian slowly turned to face him. Kyle was leaning against the opposite wall, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "And Reese?" Elian asked, the name feeling like a foreign word on his tongue. Reassigned, Kyle said, to a post in the outer sectors. A promotion, officially. In reality, an exile. He was a loose end, a reminder of the failure. Elian thought of Reese, of his kind, steady eyes, his safe, predictable life, ruined. Because of him. Because of this man standing before him. You destroyed his life, Elian whispered, the accusation sharp. He was a good man. He was a cog in a machine that was grinding you to dust, Cale countered, his voice low and intense. He was kind in the way a zookeeper is kind to a beautiful, caged bird. He would have fed you and admired your plumage, but he would never have unlocked the door. The accuracy of the metaphor was infuriating. It was the exact thought Elian had had himself. You think this is better? Elian demanded, gesturing wildly at the squalid little room. This hole? This is freedom. It is a beginning, Kyle said, pushing off the wall and taking a step closer. Freedom isn't a place, Elian. It's a choice. The choice to feel. The choice to fight. The choice to be who you were born to be, not what they conditioned you to be. He stopped, his gaze dropping to the pulse point at Elian's wrist, the place where Reese's gentle, meaningless mark would have been. They teach you that your Omega nature is a weakness, a sickness to be managed, a vulnerability. They lie. It is a strength. Your empathy, your senses. They have been blunted, but they are not gone. Elian shook his head, a knot of fear and confusion tightening in his stomach. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? Kyle's voice was a soft challenge. That day in the chamber, you felt me before you saw me. And during the fall, you felt what I felt. You saw through my eyes. He reached out, slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal. He didn't touch Elian, but held his hand, palm up, in the space between them. Try, he murmured. Don't think. Just reach. Elian stared at Kyle's hand, at the scars crisscrossing his palm, the calluses on his fingertips. He thought of the shock of their first touch, the dizzying cascade of another's senses. He was terrified of it. He was drawn to it. Hesitantly, he lifted his own hand, his fingers trembling. He mirrored Cale's gesture, his palm facing Cale's, their hands hovering inches apart. Close your eyes, Kyle instructed, his voice a low rumble. Elian obeyed. The darkness behind his eyelids was a welcome relief. Now breathe. Find my scent. Use it as an anchor, like you did before. Elian inhaled. The scent of storm and pine, now so familiar, filled his senses. It was the only real thing in the room. Good, Cale murmured. Now push past it. Look for the feeling behind the scent, the energy, the intent. Don't just smell the storm. Feel it. Elian focused, his entire being narrowing down to the space between his hand and Kyle's. He tried to do as Cale said, to feel beyond the physical. Kwashu. First, there was nothing. Just the heat from Kyle's skin, the faint vibration of his voice in the air. He was about to give up, to pull away and call this a madman's game, when he felt it. A flicker, a tiny spark in the darkness of his mind. It was like a faint echo, a whisper of a feeling that was not his own. He pushed towards it, tentatively. The spark grew, blossoming into a complex tapestry of emotion. He felt a fierce, unwavering protectiveness directed at him. He felt a deep, bone-deep weariness, the exhaustion of a long fight. He felt a core of loneliness, vast and cold as a winter sea, and beneath it all, a current of something hot and sharp, a yearning so intense it was almost painful. It was Cale. It was his soul, laid bare. And in that soul, Elian saw a flash of memory, a memory that was not his. He saw a room, much colder and brighter than this one, a laboratory. He saw a young boy with dark hair and defiant silver eyes strapped to a table. He saw men in white coats, his father's face among them, younger, but just as cold. He saw needles and machines. He heard the boy screaming, a raw, primal sound of defiance. He smelled the boy's scent, an untamed alpha scent, being forcibly neutralized, scrubbed away by chemicals and pain. The vision was so vivid, so real, it tore a gasp from Elian's lungs. His eyes flew open. He was staring at Kale, whose own face was a mask of strained concentration. Kale knew. He had seen it too. He had let Elian see it. "What was that?" Elian whispered, his hand dropping to his side. "My past," Kale said, his voice rough. "And yours." Elian stared at him, his mind reeling. "Mine? I don't remember that." "They took the memories," Kyle said, his fists clenching at his sides. "They do it. To all of them. The ones who are too strong, the alphas who won't break, the omegas who are too vibrant. They take them as children to the special conditioning centers. They try to rewire them, to turn alphas into betas, to turn omegas into docile ornaments. They did it to me. They did it to you." Elian's heart hammered in his chest. A conditioning center. He had vague, dreamlike memories of his childhood, of a place that was not his home, a place of white walls and soft-spoken instructors who taught him posture and etiquette and emotional control. He had always assumed it was a standard, elite boarding school. "I was with you?" he breathed, the question a fragile wisp of sound. Kale nodded, his silver eyes filled with a profound, ancient sorrow. "We were children. They kept us in adjoining cells. We couldn't see each other, but we could feel. We could smell each other through the vents. Your scent, jasmine and rain. It was the only thing that got me through the treatments. You were my anchor." A memory, fragmented and dreamlike, surfaced in Elian's mind. The smell of ozone and pine, a comforting presence in a cold, lonely room. A sense of, fierce, defiant spirit just on the other side of the wall, a silent companion in his fear. He had thought it was an imaginary friend. "I promised myself," Kale continued, his voice thick with emotion, "that if I ever got out, I would find you. I would get you out too. It took me years. I had to fight my way up from the gutters of this city. I had to join the enforcers, learn their systems, just to get access to the Citadel's records, just to find your name." He looked at Elian, his gaze burning with the intensity of a vow fulfilled. "I didn't steal you on a whim, Elian. I didn't crash your wedding out of some primal instinct. I came to keep a promise I made to a scared little boy in the dark. I came to set you free." Elian sank onto the edge of the cot, his legs no longer able to support him. His entire life, his identity, everything he had believed to be true, was a lie. He was not a Valerius by nature, but by force. His placid temperament was not a gift, but a scar. His father was not just a stern patriarch. He was a monster who had experimented on his own son. He looked at Kale, this stranger who was not a stranger at all, this brutal warrior from the Undercity who was the only link to his true past, to his true self. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. The words repeated in his mind, no longer his father's, but his own. A new thought, fragile and terrifying, began to form. He was not a prize. He was a person who had been stolen from himself long before Kale had ever shattered that window. And Kale hadn't stolen him. He had come to give him back. The weight of the revelation was crushing, but beneath it, for the first time in his life, Elian felt the faint, tentative stirring of something that felt like hope. The revelation shattered the silence between them, replacing it with something more complex and fragile, a tentative, spoken truce. Elian began to ask questions, his voice hesitant at first, then gaining strength as his thirst for the truth overcame years of conditioned reticence. Kale answered, his words measured and deliberate, painting a grim picture of the concordance that lay beneath its pristine white facade. He spoke of the conditioning centers, hidden facilities where children who displayed non-compliant dynamic traits, strong alpha territorialism, potent omega nesting instincts were taken. Their official purpose was social harmonization. Their real purpose was suppression, using a combination of psychotropic drugs, pheromonal neutralizers, and memory-altering therapies. The Citadel systematically broke down the very essence of who they were. Most were successfully reintegrated as placid betas or dulled, compliant versions of their former selves. But some, the strongest ones, resisted. Kyle was one. He had been too old, too defiant. The treatments had scarred him, but hadn't broken him. He had escaped during a transfer, a half-feral teenager cast into the brutal ecosystem of the Undercity. He survived, he fought, he rose through the ranks of the forgotten, his past a fire that fueled him, the memory of a scent of jasmine and rain, a singular point of light in the darkness. Elian listened, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. He was one of the successes. The treatments had worked on him. They had taken a vibrant, feeling child and sculpted him into a perfect, empty doll. The memories were gone, but the echoes remained. His lifelong aversion to strong sense, his chronic feeling of detachment, the strange, recurring dreams of a cold room and the comforting smell of a distant storm. It was all part of a tapestry he was only now beginning to see. "My father," Elian said one evening, the words tasting like poison. "He oversaw this. He did this to me." Kale was sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, the only sound in the room. He didn't look up. Valerius wasn't just an overseer, he was an architect. He believes dynamic-driven emotions are the root of all chaos, the source of the old world's fall. He sees what he's doing not as cruelty, but as a necessary surgery on the soul of humanity. He believes he is saving the world by perfecting it. "By destroying it," Elian corrected, his voice a low, bitter whisper. Kyle finally looked up, his silver eyes meeting Elian's across the small room. "Yes." In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred. The tiny metal room, which had once felt like a prison, began to feel like a sanctuary, a cocoon. The outside world, with its lies and its dangers, was held at bay by the thick metal door. Inside, there was only the truth, stark and painful as it was. Elian found himself watching Kale with a new perspective. He saw not a captor, but a survivor. The scars on his body were not just signs of violence, but a map of his struggle. The grim set of his jaw was not cruelty, but a shield forged in years of hardship. The possessiveness in his gaze was not about ownership, but about a promise kept across a gulf of time and pain. He started to notice the small things, the way Kyle always made sure Elian ate first, even when the rations were barely enough for one. The way he would subtly position himself between Elian and the door when he slept, a silent guardian. The way his scent, once so overwhelming, would soften and lose its sharp edges whenever Elian was distressed. a subconscious act of comfort. One night, Elian was jolted awake by a nightmare. He was back in the White Room, the smell of antiseptic burning his nose, his father's cold eyes watching him as a needle slid into his arm. He sat bolt upright on the cot, a strangled cry caught in his throat, his body drenched in a cold sweat. Kyle was on his feet in an instant, crossing the room in 2 silent strides. He didn't turn on the light. He simply knelt by the side of the cot, a large, dark shape in the gloom. "A memory?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Elian couldn't speak. He could only nod, wrapping his arms around himself, trying to stop the violent trembling that racked his body. He felt a phantom pain in his arm, a cold dread that was more than just a dream. Kale hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached out and placed a hand on Elian's shoulder. His touch was warm and solid, a grounding weight against Elian's trembling frame. "Breathe," Kyle murmured, the same command he had given in the alley. "It's not real. It's over. You're here. You're safe." The simple words, spoken in that deep, resonant voice, were a lifeline. Elian focused on the warmth of Kyle's hand, on the steady, reassuring presence beside him. He inhaled, and the scent of storm and pine filled his lungs, chasing away the sterile chemical smell of the nightmare. This time, he didn't just use the scent as an anchor. He leaned into it, a part of him instinctively seeking its comfort. He felt Kyle's emotions brush against his own, a current of fierce, protective anger directed not at Elian, but at the memory that haunted him. He felt Kyle's regret that he couldn't have saved him sooner. The shared emotions were not overwhelming. They were a balm. Elian's trembling slowly subsided. The cold dread receded, leaving only a profound, aching sadness. He looked at Kale, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. He could just make out the grim line of his mouth, the sorrow in his silver eyes. "They told me I was lucky," Elian whispered, his voice hoarse. "To be born an Omega in the Citadel, to be protected from my own volatile nature. They told me I was fragile." Kyle's grip on his shoulder tightened, almost imperceptibly. "They lied," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "There is nothing fragile about you, Elian. You survived them. Your spirit is buried, not broken. I saw it that day in the chamber. I see it now." Without thinking, Elian reached up and placed his hand over Kyle's. The contact was electric, a current of warmth and energy passing between them. Kyle's hand was rough and calloused, Elian's smooth and slender. The contrast was a testament to the different worlds they had inhabited, the different lives they had been forced to lead. Yet, in that moment, in the shared darkness, they felt like 2 halves of a whole. "Teach me," Elian said, the words surprising him as much as they did Kale. "Teach me how to be real, how to use this thing you say I have." Kyle was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching Elian's face in the dark. Elian could feel the conflict in him, the protective instinct warring with the knowledge that to teach Elian was to expose him to more danger. But he could also feel the underlying current of hope, the belief in the person Elian could become. "It will not be easy," Kyle said finally. "It will hurt. To feel again after being numb for so long, it's like waking a frozen limb." "It already hurts," Elian replied, his voice gaining a new, steely resolve. "I would rather feel pain than feel nothing at all." A slow smile spread across Kyle's face. It was the first genuine smile Elian had ever seen from him. and it transformed his harsh features, making him look younger, less burdened. "All right," he said. "We start tomorrow." He gave Elian's shoulder a final, firm squeeze, and then retreated to his own side of the room, leaving Elian alone in the darkness. But for the first time since he had been brought here, he did not feel alone. He lay back down, the phantom warmth of Kale's hand still tingling on his skin, the scent of the storm a comforting presence in the air. He did not sleep. He waited for the dawn, not with dread, but with a fierce, terrifying, and utterly exhilarating sense of anticipation. His life in the citadel was over. He had been declared dead. A funeral was being held for a ghost, and here, in a metal box deep in the heart of the Undercity, Elian was about to be born. The training began not with weapons or fighting, but with sensory immersion. Kale's method was simple and brutal, controlled exposure. He would bring things into their small room, objects from the world outside, and force Elian to truly experience them. It started with a piece of rusted metal. "Hold it," Kyle commanded. Elian took the jagged piece of scrap, his nose wrinkling at the sharp, metallic smell. "Don't just hold it. Feel it," Kale instructed, his voice patient. "Close your eyes. What is its texture? Is it rough, smooth, sharp? What is its temperature? Is it colder than the air around it? What does it smell like? Not just rust. What's underneath? The memory of oil, of rain." Elian did as he was told, forcing his mind to focus, to peel back the layers of sensory information. He felt the rough, flaky texture of the rust, the surprising coldness of the metal, the sharp edges that threatened to cut. He inhaled, and beneath the dominant scent of oxidation, he found a faint, greasy smell of old lubricant and the clean, mineral scent of rainwater. It was exhausting. After 10 minutes of focusing on a single piece of junk, his head throbbed, and he felt as drained as if he'd run a mile. His senses, so long dormant, were like atrophied muscles, screaming in protest at being used. Kyle was relentless. He brought him a handful of damp earth, a strange, pungent fungus that grew in the tunnels, a piece of worn leather, a cup of the bitter, stimulating drink they called stim caf. Each object was a lesson. Each session left Elian feeling raw and exposed, his mind reeling from the influx of information. The hardest part was the empathic training. Kyle would sit across from him, their hands hovering apart, and instruct Elian to listen with more than his ears. "I am thinking of a place," Kyle said one afternoon. "Find it." Elian closed his eyes, anchored himself with Kyle's scent, and reached out with his mind, pushed past the surface emotions, Kale's ever-present watchfulness, his low-level physical discomfort from an old injury, and searched for an image. He found it, faint at first, then growing stronger. A vast, open space, a sky choked with reddish-brown clouds, the skeletal remains of ancient skyscrapers like broken teeth against the horizon. The ground was cracked and barren, the outlands, the toxic wasteland that surrounded the entire metroplex. He could feel the wind, a dry, gritty thing that stung the eyes. He could feel the profound sense of desolation, but also a sliver of freedom, the freedom of emptiness. "The Barrens," Elian whispered, opening his eyes. "West of the city." Kale gave a curt nod, a flicker of approval in his silver eyes. "Good. You're a natural. They couldn't burn it all out of you." The progress was slow, painful, but undeniable. Elian began to feel the world around him with a startling new clarity. The constant thrum of the Undercity was no longer a chaotic noise. It was a symphony of individual sounds, each with its own story. The complex miasma of smells was no longer nauseating. It was a map of the territory, a language he was beginning to understand. He was waking up, and as his senses sharpened, so too did his awareness of Kale. He was no longer just a presence. He was a universe of sensory detail. Elian could read his moods in the subtle shifts of his scent, the sharp tang of ozone when he was angry or on edge, the deep, earthy smell of petrichor when he was calm or contemplative. He could feel the low thrum of Kale's energy, a constant, powerful current in the small room. The proximity that had once been terrifying became a strange sort of comfort. Kyle's presence was a steady, grounding force in the whirlwind of Elian's transformation. The unspoken tension between them also grew, evolving from fear and resentment into something far more complex and dangerous. It was in the way their eyes would meet and hold for a second too long. It was in the accidental brush of their hands as Kyle passed him a water pouch. It was in the deep, resonant timbre of Kyle's voice when he guided Elian through a meditation, a sound that vibrated through Elian's bones and settled low in his belly. One evening, Kyle returned from one of his forays with a deep gash on his forearm, his sleeve soaked in dark blood. Elian's breath caught in his throat. What happened? A disagreement over territory, Kyle said, his voice tight with pain as he shrugged off his jacket. It's nothing. It was not nothing. The cut was deep, still weeping blood. Without a word, Elian went to the small sanitation unit and dampened a clean cloth. He returned to where Kyle was sitting on the edge of the cot, fumbling with a med kit. Let me, Elian said, his voice quiet but firm. Kyle looked up, surprised. He was about to refuse, the default self-reliance of a lone wolf, but he saw the resolve in Elian's eyes and hesitated. He slowly extended his arm. Elian knelt before him and gently took his forearm. The skin was hot to the touch. He carefully cleaned the wound, his movements precise and steady. His training in the Citadel had included basic first aid, a skill considered appropriate for a high-status Omega, should their partner ever require minor assistance. The irony was not lost on him. As he worked, he was intensely aware of Kyle's gaze on him, of the way the muscles in his arm tensed under his touch. Elian's own senses were on high alert. He could smell the sharp, metallic tang of Kale's blood, and underneath it, a spike in Kale's pheromones, a scent of pain and something else, arousal. The realization sent a jolt through him, a corresponding flare of heat in his own body. His Omega biology, so long suppressed, responded instantly, instinctively, to the scent of a wounded, powerful alpha. A faint, sweet scent of jasmine began to bloom from his own skin, a pheromonal offering of comfort. He faltered for a second, his hands trembling. He could feel the bond between them, the fragile psychic link, humming with a new, dangerous energy. It was no longer just a conduit for memories and emotions. It was now carrying a current of raw, physical desire. He forced himself to focus, to finish cleaning and bandaging the wound. When he was done, he tied off the bandage and risked a glance up at Kyle's face. Kyle's expression was taut, his jaw clenched, his silver eyes dark and turbulent as a storm-tossed sea. He was staring at Elian, not with the detached watchfulness of a guardian, but with the raw hunger of an alpha. Elian, Kyle rasped, his voice thick. The sound of his name, spoken in that tone, was like a physical touch. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with unspoken things. The space between them seemed to shrink, to crackle with a palpable energy. Kyle lifted his uninjured hand and slowly, hesitantly, cupped Elian's jaw. His thumb stroked across Elian's cheekbone, the calloused skin a rough, exquisite friction against Elian's smooth cheek. Elian's breath hitched. He did not pull away. He leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering shut. This was what he had secretly read about, what he had shamefully dreamed of. This terrifying, exhilarating, all-consuming fire. It was not the gentle, polite affection Rhys would have offered. It was a maelstrom, a force of nature, and every part of him, body and soul, yearned to be swept away by it. Kyle leaned in, his head dipping towards Elian's. His scent was overwhelming now, a potent cocktail of storm and desire. Elian could feel Kyle's breath, hot and ragged, against his lips. He was going to kiss him. He was going to claim him. And Elian was going to let him. Just as their lips were about to meet, a loud, insistent banging echoed from the metal door. The sound shattered the moment like a pane of glass. Kyle recoiled as if struck, his hand dropping from Elian's face. The hunger in his eyes was instantly replaced by a cold, lethal alertness. He was on his feet in a second, the injured arm forgotten, his body positioned between Elian and the door. He held up a hand, signaling for silence. The banging came again, harder this time. "Kyle, open up. It's a sweep, sector-wide. They're looking for him." The voice was muffled, female, and laced with panic. Kyle swore under his breath, a vicious, angry sound. He glanced back at Elian, his expression grim. The tender, vulnerable moment was gone, annihilated by the harsh reality of their situation. They were not two people discovering each other in a quiet room. They were a fugitive and a target, hiding in a box, and the hunters were closing in. The concordance had come for him, and their sanctuary was about to become a trap. Kale moved with a speed that was terrifyingly efficient. "The back," he snarled, grabbing his pack and a long, dark coat from a hook. He shoved the coat at Elian. "Put it on. Hood up. Now." He crossed to the far wall, the one with the grimy, sealed porthole. He struck the wall in 3 specific places with the heel of his hand. A low, grinding sound echoed in the room, and a rectangular section of the wall, previously seamless, slid sideways, revealing a dark, narrow passage. It was a maintenance tunnel, barely wide enough for one person, smelling of rust and decay. The woman outside banged on the door again. "Kale, they're 2 blocks out, full squad, with a scryer." A scryer. Elian's blood ran cold. Scryers were the Concordance's ultimate tracking tool. Rare, powerful psychics, usually failed Omega or Alpha candidates from the conditioning centers, whose abilities had been warped and weaponized. They could sense a person's unique pheromonal signature from a distance, cutting through the chaos of the Undercity like a knife. They were hunting him specifically. Kale grabbed Elian's arm, his grip hard and urgent. "Go," he commanded, pushing him towards the opening. "Follow the tunnel. It will lead to the lower levels, to the old transit lines. Wait for me at the abandoned West 4 station." "Wait for you?" Elian's voice was tight with panic. "You're not coming." "They're looking for you," Kyle said, his back to Elian, as he began pulling small, metallic objects from his pack. "The scryer is keyed to your scent. If we run together, they'll find us in minutes. I have to create a diversion. Lead them the other way." He turned, and in the dim light, his face was a mask of grim determination. He held out a small, flat disc. "Take this." It was a comm unit. "It's short range and encrypted. I'll contact you when it's clear. Elian stared at him, his heart pounding. The idea of leaving Kale, of being alone in the dark, unfamiliar tunnels, was terrifying. The fragile world they had built in this room was about to be torn apart. "I'm not leaving you," he said, his voice shaking but firm. A flash of something, pride, affection, regret, crossed Kyle's face. It was there and gone in an instant. "This isn't a discussion, Elian," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. The Alpha command was unmistakable, a primal authority that resonated deep in Elian's bones. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order that bypassed reason and spoke directly to instinct. Elian felt his own body wanting to obey, to submit. But the training, the slow awakening Kale himself had initiated, had planted a seed of defiance. He fought the urge. "No," he said, meeting Kyle's gaze. "I can help. I can use what you taught me. I can shield my scent, or create a false trail." Kyle stared at him, a flicker of surprise in his silver eyes. He had expected obedience. He had not expected a partner. But there was no time. The sounds from outside were growing louder. Shouted commands, the tramp of armored boots. "There's no time to argue," Kale bit out. "They'll be here any second." He shoved the comm unit into Elian's hand, his fingers wrapping around Elian's for a brief, desperate moment. "Go to the station. That is an order. I will find you. I promise." He looked at Elian, his gaze intense, and for a second, the warrior fell away, and Elian saw the boy from the white room, the one who had made a promise in the dark. This was not just a strategic retreat. He was putting Elian's safety above his own. Before Elian could protest again, Kale leaned in and pressed his lips to Elian's forehead. It wasn't a lover's kiss. It was a brand, a seal, a vow. "Survive," he whispered against Elian's skin. Then he pushed Elian firmly into the tunnel. "Now go." Elian stumbled into the pitch-black passage. The wall slid shut behind him with a heavy final thud, plunging him into absolute darkness and silence. He was alone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He wanted to scream, to beat on the wall, to go back to Kale. But Kale's whispered word, "survive," echoed in his mind. He clutched the comm unit in his hand, its cool metallic shape a tangible link to the man on the other side of the wall. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the smell of damp earth and decay filling his lungs. He had to trust Kyle. He had to trust himself. He began to move, one hand trailing against the rough, cold wall of the tunnel, his other held out in front of him. He walked blindly, his heart a frantic drum in the oppressive silence. He focused his senses, just as Kale had taught him. He listened for the drip of water, the scuttling of unseen things. He smelled the shifting air currents, which told him of junctions and openings ahead. He was terrified, but it was a different kind of terror than he had ever known. It was not the helpless fear of a caged thing. It was the sharp, alert fear of a creature in the wild. It was the fear that made you run faster, think clearer, fight harder. Back in the room, Kale worked with grim purpose. He took a small device from his pack and activated it. A low hum filled the air. It was a pheromone jammer, a crude but effective tool that would momentarily scramble his own alpha scent, making him harder to pinpoint. He then took one of the protein bar wrappers Elian had discarded and placed it near the main door. Elian's scent lingered on it, faint but distinct. A perfect piece of bait. He heard the enforcers at his door. "Breach on my mark," a cold, amplified voice commanded. Kale drew two long, wicked-looking knives from sheaths on his thighs. He moved to the far side of the room, melting into the deepest shadows, his breathing slowing until it was almost non-existent. The door exploded inward in a shower of sparks and molten metal. 3 enforcers in heavy grey armor stormed in, their pulse rifles raised. They were followed by a 4th figure who was not in armor. It was a tall, slender man in a simple black uniform, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes covered by a silver visor that hummed with a faint energy. The scryer. The scryer tilted his head like a bird listening for a worm. He was here. The scryer's voice was a soft, sibilant whisper, unnervingly calm. The Omega. His scent is fresh. Fear. Arousal. He took a step into the room, his head turning. And the Alpha. He is close. He is trying to hide his scent. But I can feel his rage. It is loud. The scryer pointed a long, pale finger directly at the corner where Kyle was hiding. There. The enforcers swung their rifles around. "Light him up," the commander yelled. Kale moved. He erupted from the shadows not like a man, but like a force of pure, kinetic violence. He was a blur of black, a whirlwind of flashing steel. Before the first enforcer could fire, a knife was buried in the soft joint of his neck armor. The man gurgled and fell. Kale used the falling body as a shield, lunging forward. He slammed into the second enforcer, his shoulder hitting the man's chest with the force of a battering ram. The enforcer flew backward, his helmet cracking against the metal wall. Kyle spun, his second knife flashing out, slicing the rifle of the third enforcer in half. He kicked the man's legs out from under him and brought the hilt of his knife down on his helmet in a single, brutal motion. It was over in less than 5 seconds. 3 armored enforcers down and disabled. Only the scryer remained. The scryer had not moved. He stood amidst the carnage, his head tilted, an eerie, serene smile on his pale lips. "Impressive," he whispered. "You are even stronger than your profile suggested. Subject Kyle." Kale stood panting, his knives held ready. He knew he couldn't kill this man. The scryers were too valuable to the Concordance. Harming one was a death sentence 1,000 times over. "Where is the Omega?" the scryer asked, his voice soft and persuasive. "Give him to us, Kale. You cannot protect him forever. Prefect Valerius wants his property back. He is very displeased." "He's not property," Kale growled, his voice a low rumble of pure hatred. "Then he is a failed experiment," the scryer said, with a shrug. "And failed experiments must be decommissioned. It is a matter of quality control. You of all people should understand that." The scryer's smile widened. "We felt your little connection. The resonance. It is a fascinating anomaly. The prefect wishes to study it before he dissects you both." Kyle launched himself at the scryer. He wasn't trying to kill him. He was trying to get past him, out the door, to lead them away from the escape tunnel. The scryer didn't flinch. He simply raised a hand. "Sleep," he whispered. A wave of pure psychic force, cold and immense, slammed into Kyle's mind. It was nothing like the gentle, empathic connection he shared with Elian. It was a battering ram, a brutal, overwhelming assault designed to crush his consciousness. Kyle roared, fighting it, his own formidable will a shield against the attack. He felt the blood vessels in his nose burst from the strain. The room swam, his vision doubling. He staggered, dropping to one knee, his knives clattering to the floor. The scryer took a calm step forward, looking down at the kneeling Alpha. "Such a stubborn will, so much defiance. It is a flaw in your design, a flaw we will correct. He raised his hand again, preparing for the final, crushing blow that would render Kyle unconscious. But as he focused his power, his head snapped to the side, his attention suddenly diverted. His silver visor glowed brighter. "Wait," the scryer whispered, a flicker of confusion on his face. Another signature, faint, but familiar. He turned his head, looking in the direction of the hidden tunnel. "Ah," he said, a slow smile of discovery spreading across his face. "Clever. A false trail. But not clever enough." He ignored the kneeling, bleeding Kyle. His priority had just changed. He turned and glided out of the room. "Squad Beta," his voice echoed in the corridor. "The primary target is in the west wall maintenance tunnels, level 4. Seal all exits." Kale, on his knees, watched him go. He had failed. His diversion had failed. The scryer knew where Elian was, and Elian was alone. A desperate, feral rage surged through him, burning away the scryer's psychic assault. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying, his head pounding. He snatched the comm unit from his belt. "Elian," he yelled into it, his voice raw with desperation. "Elian, can you hear me? They know. They're coming for you." There was no answer, only static. The tunnel walls must be blocking the signal. He was too deep. He was alone, and the hunters were closing in. Elian moved through the darkness, his initial panic solidifying into a cold, focused determination. The tunnel twisted and turned, sometimes sloping downwards, sometimes opening into larger junctions where the air smelled different and faint, distant sounds echoed. He used his newly awakened senses as his guide, his fear a whetstone that sharpened his focus. He could feel the vibrations in the floor, the subtle shifts in air pressure. He was becoming a part of the darkness, not just a victim of it. After what felt like an eternity, he saw a faint line of light ahead. He moved towards it cautiously. It was a grated opening in the floor of the tunnel. Peering through it, he saw a vast, cavernous space below. It was the abandoned transit station. 2 rusted train husks sat on the tracks like ancient metal skeletons. The air was still and heavy with the smell of dust and decay. This was the place, West 4. He found a crumbling ladder and descended, his boots echoing in the immense silence of the station. He was here. He was safe, for now. He pulled out the comm unit Kyle had given him, his thumb hovering over the activation switch. He wanted to call, to hear Kale's voice, to know he was all right. But Kale's instructions had been clear. Wait. Calling might give away his own position. So he waited. He found a spot in the deepest shadows, behind a collapsed section of the platform, and sank to the floor, his back against the cold concrete. He drew his knees to his chest, making himself as small as possible. The silence of the station was a stark contrast to the constant thrum of the Undercity. Here, the only sound was the frantic beating of his own heart. He tried to reach out with his mind, to find Kale, but the distance was too great, the layers of concrete and metal too thick. There was only a void. Minutes stretched into an hour. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. What if Kale didn't come? What if he was captured? Or worse? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, cold spike in his chest. He was so lost in his fear that he almost didn't notice it at first. A change in the air, a subtle pressure against his mind. It was a cold, clinical presence, like the touch of a scalpel. It was not Kyle. He scrambled to his feet, his heart seizing with terror. He knew what it was. A scryer. They had found him. He could hear them now. the distant, rhythmic tramp of armored boots growing closer, the crisp, amplified commands echoing down the transit tunnels. They were sealing the station. He was trapped. Panic, pure and absolute, threatened to overwhelm him. He looked around wildly, searching for an escape. There was none. The station was a dead end. He was a rat in a box. He pressed himself back into the shadows, his breath coming in short, terrified gasps. He was going to be captured. He was going to be taken back to his father, back to the white rooms. They would dissect him, study him, and then extinguish the flickering flame of self he had only just discovered. No, the word was a silent scream in his mind. No, he would not let them. He thought of Kale, of his fierce, protective gaze, of his whispered command. Survive. He thought of the promise Kale had kept, the promise to set him free. He would not fail him. He would not go back to being a ghost. He closed his eyes, his body trembling. He did as Kale had taught him. He anchored himself, not with Kale's scent, which was absent, but with his own. He focused on the faint smell of jasmine and rain, the scent of his own fear. And then he reached out. He didn't try to hide. He did the opposite. He took all his fear, all his desperation, all his terror, and he focused it into a single, piercing, psychic scream. It was a desperate gamble, a flare shot into the darkness. He was a beacon, yes, but a beacon could also be a weapon. It could blind. The scryer, moving down the tunnel with his squad, paused. He had been tracking the Omega's faint, fearful signature, a timid mouse scurrying in the dark. But now, that signature had exploded. It was a raw, unfiltered blast of pure terror and defiance. It slammed into his senses, momentarily scrambling his focus. It was like staring into the sun. Hold, the scryer commanded, raising a hand. The target is agitated. Proceed with caution. The blast of psychic energy, Elian's desperate scream, traveled further than he could have imagined. It shot through the tunnels, through the rock and metal, a raw signal of distress. Miles away, in the upper levels, Kale was fighting his way through an enforcer checkpoint. He moved with a cold, desperate fury, his only thought to get back to the lower levels, back to Elian. He was injured, exhausted, but driven by a singular, frantic purpose. He felt the scream. It hit him like a physical blow, a spike of pure ice in his soul. It was Elian, his terror, his desperation, his defiance. It was a cry for help that bypassed all technology and spoke directly to the bond between them. And it was a location, a clear, unambiguous point on Kale's mental map. Elian, he breathed, his own fear a cold knot in his gut. He disengaged from the fight, ignoring the enforcers, and ran. He launched himself over a railing, dropping 20 feet to a lower catwalk, his body absorbing the impact with a pained grunt. He had to get there. He had to get there now. In the station, Elian felt the scryer's presence refocusing, the cold, clinical touch returning, more cautious this time. He knew he had only bought himself moments. The boots were getting closer. He could see the beams of their tactical lights sweeping across the far end of the station. He had to do more than just scream. He had to fight. But how? He had no weapon, no strength. He had only his mind, his senses. He remembered what Kyle had said. Your Omega nature is not a weakness. It is a strength. He reached out again, not with a scream, but with a delicate, focused probe. He touched the scryer's mind. He felt the cold, arrogant confidence. He felt the contempt for the failed experiment he was hunting. And he felt something else. Underneath the psychic power Underneath the conditioning, he felt an echo, a faint, buried trace of fear and pain. The scryer was like him, a product of the same system, a child who had been taken and broken. But where Elian had been hollowed out, the scryer had been twisted, his pain weaponized. Elian focused on that echo of pain. He didn't attack it, he resonated with it. He sent a wave of his own fear, his own memory of the white room, his own feeling of being a helpless child. He wrapped it around the scryer's mind like a shroud. The scryer stumbled, his hand flying to the silver visor over his eyes. His serene composure shattered. He was feeling his own buried trauma, amplified and reflected back at him by his target. "What is this?" he hissed, his voice losing its calm. He was feeling the terror of a child strapped to a table. He was smelling the antiseptic. He was seeing the cold, pitiless eyes of the doctors. The enforcers behind him paused, confused by their leader's distress. "Sir, are you all right?" "The target is fighting back," the scryer gasped, his body trembling. "He is using my own memories against me." This was Elian's chance. While the scryer was reeling, he had to move. He broke his psychic connection and ran. He didn't run for the tunnels they had come from. He ran towards the other end of the station, towards the rusted, dead trains. He scrambled into one of the carriages, the door groaning in protest. The inside was a wreck of rotted upholstery and shattered windows. It offered little cover, but it was something. He crouched down behind a row of seats, his heart hammering, trying to control his breathing, to silence his scent. The scryer, shaking, forced himself to regain control. He pushed the phantom memories away, his face pale with sweat. The rage he felt was cold and absolute. The specimen was not just resisting, it was aberrant. It was dangerous. It had to be purged. "He is in the train car," the scryer snarled, his voice losing all its sibilant softness. "The far one. Flush him out. Non-lethal rounds first. We need him alive, if possible. If not, the prefect will understand." The enforcers advanced, their rifles raised, their tactical lights cutting through the gloom of the station and converging on the train car where Elian was hiding. The beams sliced through the broken windows, pinning him in a cage of light. He was cornered. There was nowhere left to run. The first shot rang out, a high-pitched whine, and a stun pellet shattered the window just above his head, showering him with rusty flakes of metal. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. And then he heard it. A sound from the far end of the station. A roar. It was not a human sound. It was a guttural, primal cry of pure, undiluted, alpha rage. Kale. He stood on the platform, framed by the entrance of the tunnel, a figure of pure, beautiful fury. He was bleeding from a dozen minor wounds, his clothes torn, but his silver eyes burned with a light that eclipsed the enforcer's tactical beams. He held no knives, no weapons. He didn't need them. He was the weapon. The enforcers spun around, caught between their target and the new, far more terrifying threat. The scryer turned, his face a mask of disbelief. "Impossible," he whispered. "No one could get through those checkpoints that fast." Kale did not speak. He launched himself at the enforcer squad. A vengeful god descended into hell. He moved with a speed and brutality that made his earlier fight in the room look like a sparring match. He was not disabling them now, he was destroying them. He tore a pulse rifle from one man's hands and used it as a club, shattering armor and bone. He moved through their ranks like a storm, his every blow a killing stroke. The scryer watched, his face pale with a dawning horror. He had miscalculated. He had underestimated the Alpha's strength. He had underestimated the power of the bond between them. He turned his attention back to the train car, to Elian. If he could just take the Omega, he could still salvage the situation. He raised his hand, focusing all his psychic energy for one final, overwhelming attack. Elian saw the movement. He knew what was coming. He didn't have the strength to fight it head on. But he didn't have to. He reached out with his mind, not to the scryer, but to Kale. He opened himself completely, tearing down every wall, every shield. He poured all his fear, his love, his desperation, his newfound strength into the bond between them. Kale. The name was a silent, desperate shout in Kale's mind. He felt the scryer's psychic attack building, aimed at Elian. He roared, a sound of pure fury, and threw the broken rifle aside. He changed direction, ignoring the last remaining enforcer and charging directly at the scryer. The scryer saw him coming. He had a choice: attack the vulnerable Omega or defend himself against the charging Alpha. He chose defense. He dropped his attack on Elian and threw up a psychic shield just as Kyle crashed into him. The impact was immense. The shield held for a fraction of a second, then shattered like glass. Kyle's fist connected with the scryer's jaw with a sickening crack. The scryer was thrown backward, his silver visor flying off his face, his body hitting the concrete with a final, broken thud. He was unconscious before he landed. Silence descended on the station once more, broken only by Kale's harsh, ragged breathing. He stood over the fallen scryer, his chest heaving, his body shaking with the aftershocks of adrenaline and rage. The last enforcer, seeing his comrades and his commander broken, dropped his weapon and fled back into the tunnels. Kyle didn't even watch him go. He turned, his silver eyes scanning the station until they found the train car. Until they found Elian. Elian slowly rose from his hiding place, his legs trembling. He stepped out of the train car and onto the platform. He was shaking, covered in dust and grime, but he was alive. He was whole. He looked at Kale, the magnificent, terrifying Alpha, who had torn through an elite squad to save him, the man who had kept his promise. Their eyes met across the space, across the field of broken bodies and shattered armor. The bond between them hummed, a powerful, undeniable current of relief, of triumph, of a love forged in chaos and fire. Kale took a step towards him, then another. He broke into a run. Elian met him halfway. He crashed into Kale's chest, his arms wrapping around his neck, burying his face in the hollow of Kale's throat. Kale's arms came around him, crushing him in an embrace that was both fierce and desperate, his hand tangling in Elian's hair, holding him as if he would never let go. "I thought I'd lost you," Kale rasped, his voice thick with an emotion Elian had never heard from him before. It was raw, unfiltered love. "You found me," Elian whispered, his own tears finally breaking free, hot against Kyle's skin. "You always find me." Kyle pulled back just enough to look at him, his hands framing Elian's face. His silver eyes were soft, luminous, all the ferocity gone, replaced by a deep, aching tenderness. "You fought," he said, his voice filled with a wondering pride. "You fought him." "You taught me how," Elian replied, a small, watery smile touching his lips. Kyle's gaze dropped to Elian's mouth. The charged energy from the room, the moment that had been so violently interrupted, returned with a tenfold intensity. The world narrowed to the space between their lips. There were no more interruptions, no more alarms, No more running. There was only this. Kale leaned in and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a claiming. It was the taste of ozone and blood, of victory and desperation. It was the culmination of a promise made by a boy in the dark and the fulfillment of a man's deepest vow. It was fire and storm and the breaking of chains. Elian kissed him back with all the pent-up passion of a lifetime spent in silence, his body melting against Kale's, his soul soaring free. In that kiss, he was not an asset, not an experiment, not a prize. He was not a Valerius. He was not even just an Omega. He was Elian, and he was finally, irrevocably, home.